Welcome, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this Gloucester Writers Center program. My name is Paul Marion. I'm the publisher at Loom Press, and with me is John Wooding, the author of a new biography called The Power of Nonviolence, The Enduring Legacy of Richard Gregg. And we'll learn about the life of Richard Gregg, who is a significant figure from the 20th century. John Wooding is a professor emeritus in political science at UMass Lowell. He was the academic vice president for a time. And John, who is Richard Gregg, and why is he important right now as much as any time, both in America and in the world?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, the Gloucester Writers Group, for having me on. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. Yes, Richard Gregg. Richard Gregg is an American pacifist and social philosopher who died in 1974 and spanned most of the 20th century. He was a deeply religious man who was one of the first Americans to go and visit and study with Gandhi in India in 1928. And in 1934, he wrote a book called The Power of Nonviolence. But the book itself sort of took the sort of pacifist movement by storm, especially in the 1930s, as Europe was about to plunge again back into war after the horrors of World War I. And today, Richard Gregg's work resonates because I think that we're in a period of unprecedented global change and conflict. Some of that to do with the pandemic we're in the middle of, some of it to do with the rise of the alternative right and sort of rampant popular nationalism. And in particular in the United States, of course, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement as it begins to confront and deal with deeply and profoundly institutionalized racism in the United States. Most of what Gregg was saying was the only way to confront oppression and social injustice was to confront it with a nonviolent resistance. And of course, that nonviolent resistance, which he explicated and developed in The Power of Nonviolence and in subsequent work and subsequent books, he really put together a blueprint for how we should act in the face of the violent oppressor. And so much of the work that he wrote in the 1930s and through the 40s and 50s became the backbone of the civil rights movement in the United States and is now considered the basic approach that we must have towards periods of violent oppression and ways in which we can confront through demonstrations and other acts on the street to develop and promote social justice and social equity. And so he is actually very relevant to what's going on today. And many of the people who are now actively dealing with the questions of oppression, of dealing with violence in society, whether they know it or not, are using Richard Gregg's ideas and many of his strategies for dealing with it. So in a nutshell, that's how I think he really affects the current climate.
Could you talk about the development of the title of the book and how there was an evolution as a result of real world events?
I had to go back a long ways, I guess, in a sense. I mentioned earlier that Gregg was one of the first Americans to go to India and be on Gandhi's ashram in 1928. A lot of the 1920s were a reaction to World War I and the horrors of World War I in Europe in particular, but also, of course, in the United States. And in the 1930s in Europe, a highly developed pacifist movement began to emerge based on not repeating the horrors of World War I. So Gregg is emerging at that period of time and also being in India during the late 1920s and the 1930s. He's in a country which is trying to shake off the oppression of the British Empire. So the way of thinking about the emergence of this power of nonviolence is not just simply his advocacy following Gandhi of nonviolent resistance to colonialism in the Indian case, to the potential for war and its consequences in Europe in the 1930s, but also saying a lot about how nonviolent activity is and must be deeply integrated with a way of life and a critique of established systems. So for Gregg, the term the power of nonviolence, with him it's within a hyphen between non and violent, is to say to folks who read his work and for what he advocated, that without that kind of nonviolent approach, real change cannot happen, not only because that approach works, but because nonviolence is integrated and integral to a way of life that eschews all kinds of violence in society, both at the local and domestic level, within the family, and within the nature of how we produce goods and services in our society, which is something I can get into later. But for him, it is really the power not only of resistance, but it's the power of change.
You weren't somebody who was involved in a sense with Richard Gregg, 10 or 20 years ago. Could you talk about how you got introduced to Richard Gregg and the path toward the kind of primary materials that informed the book?
Yeah, it's an interesting story because 6 years ago, I'd never heard of Richard Gregg. And frankly, many people in the world have not heard of Richard Gregg. As I used to joke, who's interested in obscure dead American pacifists? And I should say at the outset, you mentioned that I was a political scientist, but the field of either biography, Gandhian studies, and the deep and profound philosophy of Gandhi, or of pacifism was something I was not knowledgeable about. I was by no means an expert. But an interesting short story of how I got involved with Richard Gregg and ended up writing a biography of him comes about because I had a colleague, John Saltmarsh at UMass Boston, and a friend. And one day we were in a cafe, we were talking as you do, and beginning to get to know each other a little bit. And I happened to mention that my father had been a pacifist. My father grew up, and I grew up in England, it's pretty obvious. My father died when I was 16, and I didn't know much about what his life had been like and what kind of life he led. But much later on, I found out not only was he a committed pacifist, but he was imprisoned by the British government in 1941 because he stood as a conscientious objector and refused what you call the draft. I told the story to my colleague John and my friend John, and he said, well, you might be interested in this fellow, Richard Gregg. Like, as I said, I'd never heard of him. And he said that Richard Gregg was a noted pacifist in the United States. But there's a link here that's sort of interesting, is that John was a very close friend of a man named Bill Copperthwaite, who had a retreat and farm up in northern Maine. Bill Copperthwaite, it turns out, was one of the most prestigious designers of the yurt and built yurts on this farm. He himself was also a pacifist and a scholar, and John was his friend. And John told me that in a yurt in northern Maine, there were several boxes of notebooks kept by Richard Gregg of his time in India and most of his life. There were about 55 or 60 notebooks. So we got the notebooks, which are now archived in the Thoreau Institute. And I began to read the notebooks and read more and more about Richard Gregg, and realized that because of the link to my father as being a pacifist, this could not only be a potential story of an important figure in the pacifist and international relations movement, but it could also be the story of my father, who I did not know. So that's how I came to do this. And I would just add to that that there were a number of really kind of interesting coincidences as I began to examine Gregg's life. His family grew up in Medford, where I now live. His parents lived here. They moved to, and his grandparents, they moved to Colorado Springs, where Gregg was born. Gregg was invited to England by the Peace Pledge Union in 1936, where he met Aldous Huxley, Bertrand Russell, some of the leading lights of the pacifist movement at that time. And my father was also a member, it turned out, of the Peace Pledge Union. In fact, in one case, in one of the notebooks, Gregg writes about meeting somebody, and that name rang a bell with me. And I remembered that that man visited my house when I was a young kid, and when I was 7 or 8 years old, and my father knew it. In addition to that, Gandhi himself, who Gregg writes extensively about, Gandhi himself was a great fan of Charles Bradlaugh in the 1880s. Charles Bradlaugh was a pacifist, an atheist, and the first atheist MP, member of parliament in England. And it so happens he was also the member of parliament of my hometown in Northampton. So these coincidences, and there were more that came about in writing it, made me realize that this, somebody was telling me I should write this biography. So in sum, I had these extensive notebooks, some connections which I then developed with remaining members of his family, and that I began to recognize the connections between Northampton, my hometown in England, India, Gandhi, pacifism, social justice, and all of those things. So the motivation became quite strong to sort of write about this man. And the more I learned about him, the more I realized he was a pivotal figure in the development of our thinking about pacifism, and in particularly about a strategy of nonviolence and how that developed. And that became later on, as perhaps we'll talk about, an underlying feature of the American Civil Rights Movement. He knew Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King sought his advice. And in fact, in a new edition of The Power of Nonviolence published in the late 1950s, Martin Luther King wrote the foreword for that. So that's how, in a nutshell, I came to do this, Paul.
You know, all the social justice turmoil, you know, exploded in a sense last summer with the George Floyd killing, and then John Lewis passed away. And I remember at the John Lewis funeral, one of his colleagues from the early civil rights movement, in effect, referenced Gregg and Gandhi. We knew, of course, you know, they were all reading the Gregg book, The Power of Nonviolence, but he mentioned the Gandhian sort of concept, Satyagraha.
Satyagraha, yes.
Yeah, and you know, a light went off in my head, and I said, you know, this commitment, you know, to this way of resisting is still alive, you know, and lives in some of these older activists and leaders who, you know, would have passed it down to others. And I just remember thinking, you know, Richard Gregg is like totally irrelevant. It's like ripped from the headlines.
Yeah, it is particularly relevant, as is Gandhi. I mean, I think we need to backtrack a little bit to talk about the origins of that. Gregg, in his early years, had been a labor arbitrator. He worked with unions. He'd been a lawyer. He was very disillusioned with modern American capitalism as it was developed at the very beginning of the past century, the 20th century. That part of that discontent manifested itself when he actually began to find out about Gandhi. This only happened in 1925. Gandhi was not well known in the United States at that period of time. And Richard Gregg suddenly decided he would up and go and live in India and invite himself to live in the Gandhi's ashram. As I said, he went there in 1928 and studied with Gandhi. He lived there in India for 4 or 5 years, meeting a number of very prominent Indian intellectuals and political activists who were part of the bludgeoning Indian independence movement, trying to throw off the yoke of the British Empire. And Gandhi is more than, of course, more than a pacifist. I mean, that's certainly what he advocated. He also advocated a much simpler lifestyle, which is something we should come back to because Gregg was unique in thinking that was important. A lifestyle which was built around, you know, small domestic industry, agriculture, a very strong belief in nutrition and organic food. And Satyagraha is suddenly the integration of all of those things, which can only be manifested in a non-violent presentation of the self to the world as a whole. So Gregg's study with him and the writing of the book Power of Nonviolence was essentially for Gregg an attempt to bring Gandhian ideas to the West, particularly to America, in terms and values and in discourse that was amenable to the West, because obviously Gandhi was writing primarily about the struggle against British imperialism. So the Power of Nonviolence becomes this book which translates Gandhian ideas and adds to them. And one great addition for Gregg, and relevant to the comment about, you know, what happened in the 1960s and 1970s and what is happening now, is that unique to Gregg, he actually advocated for extensive training for nonviolent resistance. He coined the term moral jujitsu. Moral jujitsu is the notion that if you confront a violent attacker with no response, no nonviolent response, you put that person off kilter. And when you do that as a public display, as a kind of public theater, you gain the sympathy of the onlookers, because an individual is attacking you violently, you are not resisting. Think John Lewis on the Selma Bridge and all we've seen in that. So that was part of it. The second part of it was this notion of training for nonviolence. He advocated and developed training materials as an addition to the Power of Nonviolence, the book, about how people should train to develop an integrated lifestyle and to how to act when confronted with violent attackers, particularly violence which is addressed towards movements of social justice and social change. So Gregg's ideas take from Gandhi, place them in a Western conflict, context, developed a notion that you can actually train and organize. And he used the analogy of a military strategy, which many pacifists were upset by, because the military strategy, of course, is an anathema to what we think about as pacifism, especially in the 1930s. And so the combination of this military style training for nonviolent resistance, the use of the form moral jiu-jitsu, and all of that was embodied in that, became the hallmark of the civil rights movement in the 1950s, because Greg's book was used to train people in thinking about nonviolence. But again, I want to emphasize that Greg always firmly believed, this could only be integrated into a vision of the world, which was more simplistic than modern industrial capitalism, built upon good nutrition, organically grown food, and in particular, protection of the environment and sustainability. So all of those things come together in a very, very sort of key way that resonates, I think, today with those folks who are concerned about climate change, who are concerned about resisting oppression, are concerned about racism, and concerned about how they can confront that. And I will finish by saying that Gandhi, like Greg, and Gandhi was, of course, confronting the British Army and the British state, recognized that you couldn't win militarily against those forces, and as no more than we could win militarily against any force today. But with the use of nonviolence in the strategies that he recommended, but combined with a sense of self and an approach intellectually and consciously and ideologically towards essentially love of one's fellow human being and the planet on which we live, that is the only way it could be effective. So that's how that thing stretches out over the last century and into this century in terms of resonating with the contemporary problems we face.
I'd like to shift subject a little bit. Greg is fascinating as a multifaceted person. You know, he had a kind of talent for collecting extraordinary catalytic people, and you know, he made a significant contribution in the area of non-violent resistant practices, but he also was known for his forward thinking in the areas of organic gardening, organic farming, and then, you know, related to that, the notion of living a simple life, somewhat in the Thoreau mode, but the green Greg.
The green Greg. Well, as I mentioned, he thought about sort of sustainability, protection of the environment, and respect for nature is integrated with the nonviolent approach to the world. And when he went to the ashram, of course, Gandhi was also growing their own crops on the ashram. Gandhi also advocated simple forms of textile production, organic food. Greg took that a stage further. And in fact, in the late 1930s, two things happened, or mid-1930s. In the mid-1930s, he became the director of Pendle Hill, which is a noted Quaker retreat in Pennsylvania. He was not himself a Quaker. He was a Congregationalist and a deeply religious man. But he wrote a book, The Power of Voluntary Non-Simplicity. And that term, voluntary simplicity, was coined by Greg. Here he lays out the reasons for living in the world in harmony with nature, not against nature. He'd already studied what was called biodynamic farming, which is essentially organic compost-based farming, back in the late 1940s. He developed this work around voluntary simplicity, which of course absolutely echoes with people trying to live a simple life, local food, slowing life down, respect for the environment, concern about climate change. A lot of young people, I think, today could read Voluntary Simplicity and see all of their ideas laid out in this work that came out in 1936. A little bit later on in life, during the war years, Greg basically lives the life he's advocating. He joins Helen and Scott Nearing in their maple sugar farm in Vermont. Helen and Scott Nearing were famous in the 1950s and again in the 60s for advocating organic farming and a simpler life. And they wrote a book called The Good Life, which became to some extent the Bible of the counterculture movement of the 60s. And he lived and worked there for 7 or 8 years before returning to India and connecting with other folks around that. So the whole notion of respect for the environment, respect for nature, harmony with nature, and the living a life with simplicity. And Greg was very careful in his writing to say, I'm not asking people to give up everything. I'm asking them to think about what they really need and how they can live a simpler life. And I think he does it very effectively. So there were two parallel, then joining frames for Greg's work. Social justice through nonviolent resistance, and a means to do that, and a protocol and a strategy for doing that must be integrated with this kind of respect for nature and for looking to find ways to produce food organically and carefully, with respect to the soil, with respect to people's health and nutrition. In fact, later on in life, he co-wrote a book called Companion Plants on how to grow plants without using pesticides that would deal with pests on crops and so on and so forth. So it was an integral and deeply held part of his value system, as well as that of nonviolence.
I think what makes this book a bit unusual is there are two narratives. There's the larger narrative where for the first time we see the life of Richard Gregg as a significant figure of the 20th century whose ideas go beyond that. Mm-hmm. And then, there's the second narrative of your search for understanding of your father's, decisions and, how he viewed life. When you come to the end of the book and you've told us about Gregg, you're writing about your dad and, this sort of path, being on the Gregg path has led you to sort of see that you might not have seen before. Could you, talk about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. As I mentioned, that my father was a pacifist. As I said, he died when I was 16, so I didn't really get to know him. He was a lovely man. We had no issues between us even at that point in time. And of course, when you're 16, you don't, think about these issues in very deep ways with your parents. And I come from a family, my dad was a working man. He delivered coal for a living most of his life. He had no formal education beyond the age of about 14 or 15. And I'm a product of him. And I was the first one in my family to go to college, first generation college student. I became a professor. It seems like a miracle these days. And looking back on where I came from, and then thinking more, which I did not think a lot about, and my mother never talked about very much, in part because in the 1950s in England, it was difficult to talk about your father being a pacifist. I was at school as a young kid with other young kids who had probably lost their father during the war or damaged during the war, because the war obviously was really traumatic and catastrophic for England, especially between 1941 and 1945. And that my father had gone to prison as a conscientious objector, not on religious grounds, because he didn't think people should kill each other. He believed killing people was wrong. He was imprisoned in a prison in Cardiff from the fall of 1941 to the summer of 42. Interestingly, when I began to research this little story, when the Luftwaffe attacked Cardiff, at that time it was a very important coal and steel town, so industrially it was important to the war effort. On several bombing raids in December of 1941, the prison guards would shift everybody in the prison into underground shelters when these bombing raids were going on, except for the conscientious objectors who were left out there. So there was a stigma attached to this, was very strong. And then I began to think about my dad, who, as I said, was not an educated man, not particularly prominent. He never left any residues of books or articles. What would make somebody go to prison, endure the kinds of social criticism and ostracization that he encountered, and my mother after the war and during the war, and my older brother and sister also encountered antipathy and hostility towards pacifism? Why would somebody make that kind of commitment? And when I began to get to know about Gregg, who opted and left his job as a lawyer, moved to an ashram in India and spent a lot of his time, figuring out how to deal with, frankly, human waste on the ashram, because he was interested in composting, and travel across all of India by train, meeting real Indian people, not just important Indian people. So the puzzle becomes, which I don't have the answer to, is why do unremarkable people sometimes do remarkable things? And the only answer I can have to that is, I think my father, and certainly obviously Gandhi, but also Richard Gregg, developed a very fundamentally powerful and coherent moral compass about how to live their lives. And when somebody does that, I think we should admire that, because it's in some ways, in the current period, sadly lacking, certainly in many of our leaders. That there's a question here of what is right and what is wrong, and what do I do to speak truth to power? What do I do to stand up for what I believe in, even when those sacrifices could possibly be enormous? In my father's case, it was enormous. So, the book ends up, it's a biography of Greg. It's not about my father, but the narrative of my father and interest in what drove him to do what he did began to be the underlying theme of a question about how some human beings, some people can do these kinds of extraordinary things. And Greg also did extraordinary things, and my father did extraordinary things. People who speak up for what is right. And so that dilemma, that question mark, that insight really engages me, and I want to write more about that. I mean, why do some people do that?
I think that's a fascinating, concept to explore, the notion of, on the face of it, unremarkable persons doing remarkable things. It sort of brings to mind the notion of courage. It's like how does someone act in a courageous way in a situation that matters? How do you gather yourself? It might not be just, for one moment. It might be over the course of extended time or your whole life. Making a kind of existential decision like that. A good note to close on, although I just want to ask you one more question about, Greg was called by one person the quietest radical. What do you hope, can be achieved with this biography in making him so more loud and visible?
Somebody described him as the quietest radical in history. He wasn't a charismatic figure. He gave no major speeches. There's no videos of him. There's no grave or gravestone for people to gather around and say this man played this incredibly important connecting and bridging role in history. If you read the book, you'll see the wide range of people he was friends with and communicated with, many of them very prominent, including Nero and Gandhi himself. Gandhi himself became his friend. I mean, I had letters that came backwards and forwards from Gandhi, and I was grateful to the family because I had all of his personal letters too. Gandhi was a personal friend of this guy, and at one point Gandhi said, near the end of his life, before he was assassinated, to a group of Indian leaders, he said to them, if you would all understand me as well as Richard Gregg does, I would die happy. That's a pretty major compliment from a major figure. And Greg's life, I think, it gives us a model for living in a way that I think we all could learn something from, because it's not just the question of being courageous, and he was certainly courageous, even though he was very self-effacing. And my father, I think, was courageous for going to prison and standing up for what he believed in. As you said, it's not just courage of the moment. It's how we say there's a framework of living your life in a right way. And that provides the basis for gaining the courage to stand up to those things which should be changed. And frequently, I'm afraid, we don't find that in our leaders. And I think that the model of Greg and his writings, both as a unassuming and quiet radical, is something that I would wish to model myself on if I could. And I think that his willingness to undergo a certain level of privation in his life, or my father being imprisoned, or the thousands and millions of cases of ordinary people standing up and doing these kinds of things, is exactly what we should call heroic, not what we call heroic today, which is a football player is heroic, or everybody in the army is heroic. That's not necessarily true. Ordinary people doing ordinary things are often great heroes.
That's great. Thank you, John. And I want to thank Henry and everybody at the Gloucester Writers Center. John's biography of Richard Gregg, The Power of Nonviolence, is available at loompress.com. You can get Kindle version of it on amazon.com. If you would like to recommend that your public library get a copy, we'd be very pleased to fill an order for them. We hope that we've shown you enough about Richard Gregg tonight. There are a lot of pictures of Gregg in the book, even though we don't have film of him. Thank you again, and we look forward to more programs at the Gloucester Writers Center.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And thank you, Paul. And thank you, Henry, for having me on. I really appreciate it.